Hi everyone, welcome back to the All Inclusive podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Tolu Oke, Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Diageo. We dive deep into a topic that affects many leaders, something Tolu calls the gratitude complex. We discuss how gratitude, while often seen as a positive, can sometimes hold us back from asking for what we truly deserve, especially for those from underrepresented groups and socio-economic backgrounds. We'll uncover how this shows up in the workplace, and most importantly, Tolu shares strategies on how we can reclaim our worth and break free from the patterns of undervaluing ourselves. As always, before jumping into the video, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on your notification bell, and follow on your favourite podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. That being said, let's jump in. Hi Tolu, welcome to All Inclusive.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's dive straight in. Can you share with our listeners a little bit more about your personal journey into the world of DEI and what motivated you to get into this work?
So I always start my story by saying that I kind of fell into DEI, right? So I've been doing DEI full time now for probably the last 11 years. And before that, I was a management consultant at Accenture. So completely different world in some ways. And whilst I was at Accenture, at the time you had to do what they used to call people development activities. So kind of like almost like CSR, giving back, helping other people kind of thing. And so I started picking up then, which is stuff that we now call I&D or DEI. But back then it was like doing stuff outreach with universities. It was doing stuff like mentoring. It was doing stuff with people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I just really enjoyed that stuff. And I was doing it side of desk. And so I remember when I came to the end of my second year and I was talking to my career coach, because Accenture used to give you a career coach. She kind of said to me, so I was feeling a bit dissatisfied with work. I was like, I don't really get it. Like, I'm working on all these clients, we're making models, we're doing spreadsheets, we're doing presentations. But I felt so disconnected from it because I kind of felt like if I wasn't there, the world would still go around. Like the work I'm doing to me didn't feel like it had such a big impact. And so she said to me, well, if we look at what you're doing over here and we look at what you're doing over there, it almost looks like maybe this is your passion because you're finding time to do it despite the fact that, you're doing it on top of your day job. And so I said, okay, actually, I might take your word for that. So then I then started to look into where could I put all of the work that I was doing on the side and turn that into a day job. And that's when I kind of stumbled across the work of or the field of diversity and inclusion. Although back then it was still quite new in more kind of mainstream ways. And so I left Accenture, took a break, and then I started to do what is now DEI work and social mobility work for a charity. And that's how I entered into the world of DEI.
Oh, wow, that's a really inspiring story, actually, because I think quite a few leaders do say kind of they fall into DEI. And that's why I asked that question, because I think it's so interesting because our personal journeys really do play somewhat of a role in how we do this work, because it's about helping people and we are people. so I think our own personal experience really can impact the work that we're doing in DEI. So for you, has there been like a pivotal moment that you can think of in your journey that's really had a major impact and fueled your motivation for continuing this work? Because it is quite hard and it is challenging and there are downtimes. So has there been a particular moment that you kind of look back on that, or you remember that for you kind of really is like, yes, I'm on the right track. This is the work for me?
I would definitely give two examples. So the first example will be when I was working at Sainsbury's and I was leading on race and religion at the time. And I joined in June 2019. So I joined just under a year before the murder of George Floyd. And so actually, it was a great place to be in because there was so much energy and appetite for the work that we were doing. And actually, 3 weeks before the murder of George Floyd, I had launched a Let's Talk About Race training. And so at Sainsbury's, because there was so much energy and appetite for what we were doing around the race agenda, that was one of the times that it meant so much to me, because I think it was one of the first times I had got to work specifically on race. And as a Black woman, that meant a lot to me because I realized that the conversations that we were having, the policies that we were trying to look at, the changes that we were doing had a direct impact on somebody like me. And so I almost felt like I was carrying the burden of my future, but also the community that I represented and the people that I'm amongst. And I was carrying that on my shoulders. And so there was a real personal affinity to this work because, we talk about ethnicity pay gap. the pay gap matters to me specifically as a Black woman, because if we don't close the gap, I'm not being paid fairly for what I'm doing. You know, we look at the experiences of Black consumers in the retail space. If we don't get this right, it means that I'm going to still be followed by security guards when I go into a Sainsbury's shop, despite the fact I work for Sainsbury's. And it's funny, actually, I was with my boss at the time and we went into Sainsbury's, and there was a big thing about sustainability. And she was like, oh, like, you don't need a receipt. And so she was like an older white woman. I said, I'm Black, honey. I need a receipt. Like, I will always need a receipt. I don't get to opt into being sustainable. I need a receipt, because even though I work for this company, guarantee you I could be stopped at the door because I'm buying a pack of chewing gum. I need a receipt. Like, those are my experiences. So when I was doing this work, it meant so much more to me. And then we had the murder of George Floyd. And so the profile around the work we were doing around race shot up incredibly. And then that also meant that I was now part of a global consciousness of people who are having to live in a time of trauma, police brutality. We then start to hear a lot about the metrics around, like, you know, at that point in time, Black women were more likely to die in childbirth 5 times. We were like the arrest rates for young Black boys. And all of a sudden there was just this wave of emotional overwhelm, because I'm doing this work because it matters and it means a lot to me, but I'm also part of a group that's been severely impacted by injustice. And at that moment in time, I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this work. It takes too much of who I am to do it. And the only reason that I continue to forge ahead is because I also thought to myself, if that's how I feel, I don't want the next generation to feel like this. So actually, we have to keep going so that, you know, for people who choose to have children, your children's generation won't have to endure that. And even if you don't have children, right? You know, you might have children in your life. You might know. I always call them little people. You might have little people in your life, that the little people in your life, when they're looking forward 15 to 20 years time, they don't have to endure the kind of challenges that previous generations, or maybe even our generation, have also had to go through as well. So that was a really critical time for me, and I had to decide if I would still stay the course, and I decided that I would.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm so glad that you have. But I totally resonate with when I think about the little people, and that's the reason why I do what I do. And I have this show is because I got to a point in my life after I had my daughter, and I was just reevaluating and just like, I want to try and do what I can to ensure that she doesn't have to experience any of the things that I experienced.
Yeah.
Because whilst she may not have a dark skin complexion, she still is part Black, and she will still face some form of discrimination. Hopefully not, but
Yeah.
it may happen simply because she is of a darker complexion than
Yeah.
the majority, or like her white counterpart, which we see happen still. And then she may well also have to face the fact that she's not dark enough. Sometimes she's not going to be dark enough to be able to relate to maybe another Black woman.
Yeah.
And that colorism kind of
Yeah.
conversation comes
Yeah.
into play as well for her. So there's so many different things, and that's what I was thinking of when I started this podcast. So I totally understand that, and it can sometimes feel that you are carrying the weight of all those Black
Yeah.
women in doing the
Yeah.
work that you're doing.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad that you were able to share that experience. You did say that there was two, so I'm curious, what was the second?
So the second one for me was when I got to a point where I was doing work in an organization specifically that just was rubbing against me, if that makes sense. And I oftentimes say that as a DEI practitioner, the pace at which you want to go and the pace at which an organization is ready to go may not always be the same. And so I was working for an organization, and I won't name the name, but I was working for an organization, and actually I had great buy-in from like a very significant set of stakeholders to launch and to deliver something that was quite pioneering of the time. But at the same time, there was also quite a lot of, I would say, I won't use the word backlash, that's quite a heavy word, but there was quite a lot of obstacles that had to be overcome. And I think for the first time, I was almost like, well, I don't need this, if I'm honest. Like, I'm the entirety of my day job is to make the world of work, and actually the world more generally, depending on your customers and your, my entire day job is to make other people's lives better. I don't need this. The program that I was even launching doesn't even benefit me. I'm not even an end user or a recipient of what I'm laboring and toiling over. I don't need this. And that was the first time I was like, I'm might just leave all of this and get me a job in sales because I can sell ice to a snowman or whatever they call it. So I was like, I actually maybe I don't need this. Maybe I don't need the emotional labor and the toil that comes for, in many ways, having to be a justice warrior and fight for other groups. Maybe I can mind my business, go into a commercial role, earn big commission, earn big bucks, and go home at the end of the day. Because, I've got people in my family who are accountants, they work in finance, they work in banking. They don't carry the work home with them the same way that I do.
Yeah.
So I just thought to myself, maybe there's something else that I can do where I can actually leave the emotional toil that comes from this work. I can leave that at the door, and I can just focus on being a 9 to 5 employee, get paid all the money that I need to get paid, and go to bed at night. I don't need to carry people's stories. I don't need to carry people's pains. I don't need to carry social justice movements. I don't need to carry research papers that show that some groups are being disfavored over others. I don't need to carry real life pain. I can leave that at the door.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first times I was like, this doesn't even concern me. And I'm still having to fight. Because I think for me, it was like, when will the fight end? Like, so much of the work that we do is just constantly, it can feel like fighting. And I don't like fighting.
Yeah.
If I'm Sometimes you get tired. And I think that was the second time I was like, I just don't know if I need this. Anyway, in the end, I left the organization. But yeah, that was definitely a point in time where I was just like, I don't think I need this.
Yeah. But I think in the story that you've said, yes, you decided to leave the organization, but you still continued to stay in the space of DEI, right? And so I think it's important that all of those feelings that you had were absolutely 100% valid. And as a leader in this space, it is 100% okay for you to feel that way sometimes.
Yeah.
I think so. There's a number of leaders that are in this space that want to pretend that isn't the case, and to everybody else, this work is amazing, I love it, this is my passion, it's my drive. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, but it's not like that all the time.
Exactly.
You can't love something all 100% of the time, especially this type of work, because it can be some challenging, and that's an okay feeling. And I'm glad that you were able to share with us that you had the courage to know that actually, no, it's not a case of I can't do this. It's just I can't do this work here.
Yeah.
It's not serving me to do this work here.
Yeah.
Because the battle is continuing. There is no progress being made.
Yeah. And just to add, I did deliver the program. Because I was like, one thing about me, I will finish. So I did deliver the program, but I was like, that's all you're getting, if I'm honest. Like, that was that. Yeah.
And sometimes
and
it's good to know when to go.
Yeah, exactly. I always say that sometimes we make it seem like staying is a victory. Sometimes leaving is also a victory. Because I always say that if you're in a toxic relationship with like another human being, your friends and family would probably advise you to leave. So why do we do the same with employers? We have a level of agency that allows us to choose environments that bring out the best of us. Especially as DEI practitioners, that's what we're fighting for other people. How much more for ourselves? So yeah.
So, I mean, it's evident that your journey has been both challenging and rewarding. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit into imposter syndrome, which I think is a topic that a lot of people can relate to, especially from diverse and underrepresented groups, and multi-generational groups, like what the workforce as well, because it comes in different waves and it presents itself differently across generations. So how would you define imposter syndrome, and why do you think it's so prevalent? Because we hear about it all the time.
So I'm a bit of an outlier, right, when it comes to imposter syndrome, a bit of a renegade. So I no longer believe in imposter syndrome in the way it's been defined. Because I came across a tweet. This was 2021, 3 years ago, and I can't remember the guy's name. I think he's a Queen's Counsel, and his name is, I'm going to say it's Thomas something. I can't remember. But he basically said that, is it imposter syndrome or is it trespasser syndrome? And he said trespasser syndrome is when the environment thinks that you're trespassing. Imposter syndrome is when you think that you're an imposter. And I think the more that I started to redigest on that, back in 2021, I realized I don't think what we call imposter syndrome is really imposter syndrome. It's actually the environment that makes you feel like an imposter. And what do I mean? I mean, we've all gone past like construction sites or car parks or whatever, and there's a sign that says that trespassers beware. Because that environment has said that if you do not have the right to be here, you are defined as a trespasser. And by law, if you are a trespasser, the law can tell you to leave. You do not belong in this environment. You do not belong in this car park. If somebody comes to their, if somebody is invited into your home, they're a guest. If somebody comes to your home and you don't want them to be there, they're a trespasser. And if they're a trespasser or a burglar, you can call the police. What am I saying? The same thing for the workplace. If you work in a really wonderful workplace, 9 out of 10 times you may still feel like an imposter, but probably less so, because the environment welcomes you. The environment says, guess what? You belong here. Guess what? This role was made for you. Guess what? You are thriving in this industry. Guess what? You are recognized and rewarded. Guess what? We love you here. But if you're working in an environment that rejects you, you feel like you're trespassing. Everywhere you go, you don't belong. Everywhere you go, guess what? They're a burglar. And the environment makes you feel like a trespasser. So I actually feel like what we call imposter syndrome, yes, does actually, it is true for many people sometimes on an internal basis. But I think a lot of what we experience is actually trespasser syndrome, when the environment says you don't belong, you shouldn't be here, and then you spend the rest of your time trying to prove that you do belong there. So for imposter syndrome, that's definitely one thing I want to position and throw out there. You then mentioned a bit, which I think is a really important nuance, around like underrepresented groups, age, and stuff like that as well. So a couple of years ago, about 2015, I coined a term called the gratitude complex. And I talk about a lot about this on podcasts and stuff like that, but I coined a term called the gratitude complex. And that's really about, especially for people from underrepresented backgrounds, socially mobile backgrounds, by the time you start to add intersectionality to it, it could be women who grew up in low income families, it could be ethnically diverse people, people who are disabled, people who are of an older age. And there's all of a sudden you become grateful for certain things that actually are normal. So what am I saying? So you get offered a job, and because they're paying you more money than you've ever earned in your life, than your parents ever earned, than your friends have earned, you're so grateful you don't even negotiate. You're so grateful you don't even ask for the benefits. You're so grateful you don't even ask, what else can I have? And then you leave money on the table. Or you're so grateful for a promotion, you don't realize that actually your peers have been given, a big title promotion, but you've been given more scope and no promotion increase on salary, no title increase. You're so grateful that you're in certain kinds of environments and certain kinds of settings that you don't realize that you're still being shortchanged, because there's a gratitude complex that says, I'm going further than anybody else that I've ever known. I have no role models. I've become the role model, but not knowing that compared to everybody else, you're still lagging behind. I never forget one of my friends, and she was telling me, actually, this was about probably 5 years ago. She was a Black woman managing a team, and she found out that the older white guy in her team was being paid more than her. And sometimes you would say, okay, yes, they might have more experience. Let's assume that more experience comes with age, because maybe you've been working for longer, fine. So she was like, well, then he can manage the team. If he's being paid more than me, he can manage the team. And so in that moment, she said, I'm not playing into the gratitude complex. I'm not going to be grateful for promotion to manage a team, to take on more responsibility, and somebody else that I'm managing is getting paid more than me. That's an error. And so, but people who are grateful will, oh my gosh, I'm now the head of this team, not knowing that half of the team are being paid more than them anyway. So the gratitude complex also plays into imposter syndrome, because you're so grateful to be in the room.
Yeah, it's
You're
like,
so grateful to have a seat.
I know, I agree, and I think it's knowing your self-worth, and it's difficult to know that, because I think the way that we most people, and especially I think those from underrepresented groups and those from lower income households, is the way that we know our own self-worth is depicted against the surroundings and the environment of those that have come before us and that are surrounding us. So if I am already ahead of those that I grew up with, those that are older than me, those that are within my family, my area where I live, if I'm already there, it's difficult for me to then know that how much more I'm worth than what I am surrounded by. And I think it plays also into surround yourself with those that are, I wouldn't say above you, but those that are who you want to be, those that are at levels that you're wanting to aspire to. Surround yourself with those people, because then automatically you then will start to envision yourself at that level, and your self-worth will just naturally go up, and you'll be like, actually, no, I do deserve more. And as you just said, it's like, well, you can manage the team. If you're at a salary of that's higher than mine, clearly they're valuing your work, and the contributions that you're making to this organization over mine.
Yeah.
So you should have that responsibility of managing the team and the success of that team. I totally agree with you, but it's a great concept, I think, that gratitude complex. I haven't heard of it before. I have heard of, in terms of the fact that we feel that we are grateful for these opportunities, but I like that terminology. I think it's important to explore further. And so, have you kind of personally, for you, have you experienced this in your career journey?
Absolutely. And that's the reason I coined the term. So when I was working for a social mobility charity, I was leading national programs with employers like KPMG, McKinsey, but then also the civil service. And so I remember I was in a meeting with my then boss at the time. He was the CEO of the charity. And we were in a meeting with the civil service. And this is 2015, 2016. And we were talking, because it was a social mobility charity, we were talking about the work, and then all of a sudden the term just came to me, and I'd been mulling on over it. But then I was talking to this lady in the civil service about, why do people from these backgrounds find it difficult? And then because obviously I was working for the charity, I'd been mulling over it, my own experiences, family experiences, friends experiences, and then also the students I'm working with. And I said to her, it's a gratitude complex, and the word just slipped out of my mouth. And that was in 2015. And ever since then, I've carried it, and I've talked about it on podcasts, and other D&I practitioners have also used it, and kind of it's starting to kind of bubble round. And I trademarked it as well, because I got to be very clear, one of the other things that as ethnically diverse people, we don't tend to do is also own our language, And when you look at the likes of like Rennie Edo Lodge, and she wrote her book about why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, people kind of ran with her content, but everybody knew where it came from.
Yeah.
We oftentimes talk about the concept of intersectionality, and we ascribe honor to where it came from. So I think it's also important when we look at ethnically diverse people, but also people from lower socio-economic backgrounds, that you are also getting, quote unquote, the credit for your work, which also doesn't happen. You go to a meeting, someone else is presenting your work, you won't speak up. So that's another aside. So I'm in that meeting, and then I just threw out the term gratitude complex, because I had realized that I was in situations where I was being paid far less than other people around me, but I was so grateful because I was earning more than I even thought was possible. And it was only, as exactly like you said, Natasha, only when I stepped out of my bubble and I started to lean into other bubbles, I was like, oh, so you're doing this and you're getting paid that. Or even, I didn't even know that these kind of jobs existed. Tell me more about what a strategist does. I've never really heard of that. Tell me more about what this does. And I started to just widen my aperture. I talk a lot about, if you see life as a photo that you're taking, broaden your aperture. A good photographer knows how to get the light in, the contrast, all of that. Do that with life. Do that with the people around you. Widen your aperture. So I started to lean into circles. I started to reach out to people just to learn more about what they do. Okay, so on average, how much ballpark figure, from a band, how much should you be getting paid for this role? So when I started to go into interviews and negotiate for roles, I'd be like, well, what's your band? Oh, that's too low. And I'd leave. I never forget, there was a tier one investment bank I was interviewing with. I had come in for the first round interview. They liked me. They invited me to the second round interview. At the point of the first round interview, I forgot that I hadn't even clarified on salary expectations. So before I went to second round, I said, what are the salary expectations for this role? And they told me, and I was like, nope, too low. And they said, well, that's the only budget we have. And I said, well, then that's fine. I'm not coming to your second round. And that was it. And part of this, and not everybody will have that risk appetite, right? Because one thing about me, I'm fitting to leave. Okay. The door is on the latch, because I know that there is always something out there, and I will not shortchange myself accordingly. But not everybody has that level of risk appetite. So don't just do that because I said it. But in that moment, it was like I would either go through a process, and because I knew I was highly qualified for that role, I would then go in on a lower salary than expected, a lower salary that my friends in banking had also told me should come with that role, just because it was a tier one investment bank, and end up doing a role where I'm actually giving more than I'm being paid for. So for me, part of the gratitude complex is, once you recognize that actually you do have it, is then you need to say, well, I'm not going to have it anymore. And also that means being willing to walk away, sometimes, not always, from things that will keep you stuck in gratitude. I always say, don't let your gratefulness be the reason that you're hungry. If there's still food left on the table, don't be, oh, I'm just gonna have a little apple when there's a whole banquet available. No, get your banquet.
I love it. No, what would you say from an organisation perspective, in the knowledge that there are employees coming into the workforce that are going to be having these experiences, and and that may well also have that trespassing syndrome, that imposter syndrome. What strategies do you think that they should be putting in place to help support these employees?
I think that's a great question, because I actually think that there's two parties in all of this, right? You have the individual
Yeah.
who's working through their own inner kind of experience, but then you actually have the organization, which should make it easier. Because actually, if all organizations have fair and equitable processes, right? You have transparent pay bands on your websites, or at the point at which you're starting to talk to the recruiter's being transparent and they're saying, well, this role is at this level. All of our roles are, and in the whole interview processes where you speak to different employers, recruiters will tell you all of our roles are graded externally. I think sometimes is it like Willis Tower Watson, certain organizations will grade roles and they will tell you, the civil service does it. Like, a lot of those organizations,
Yeah.
they'll say this is a band E, or the NHS,
Mm-hmm.
this is a band 6 role. This is the pay thingy for the band. So they tell you up front, this is what is on the table, and how we measure your experience against the job description decides where we put you. So it means that if you're somebody who has the trespasser syndrome, the imposter syndrome, the gratitude complex, you at least know what you're playing with. So that means if someone says the role is between 10,000 and 20,000, you then know, okay, cool, I've got a 10 grand window, as opposed to somebody offering you 10 grand and they've got a 40 grand budget. So I think the first thing is organizations can be transparent either on the website when they put the job out, or at least in interview, what is the banding or the maximum amount that they can pay for a role. I think that's what we need to level the playing field on that. I think the second thing that organizations can also do is recognize that what they're looking for may show up differently. And I use this example a lot, especially in the social mobility space and some of the work that we're doing. I say, if you're in a meeting and you're looking for somebody to constantly raise their hand, constantly have opinions, constantly, challenge healthily, you may not get that from some individuals who have either different cultural expectations around hierarchy and speaking up externally in meetings, or confidence issues, etc. You may not find that. So what you're looking for, you may not see, and you're translating somebody being quiet, not speaking up, as being disinterested. You think they don't have an opinion. You think they're disengaged. Even from a neurodiversity perspective, they might not be a fast reflector. It might take them more time to process information. But what you're doing is you're rewarding the loudest person in the room. You're rewarding the person who, just to leapfrog off that point, just to build on that point, you're rewarding that because that looks like they're visibly partaking in the meeting. But you've got other people in the meeting who have different experiences, different backgrounds, but they're still actively participating. So also organizations need to understand what they're looking for, how they measure, those really soft cultural things, right? How they measure confidence, how they measure interest, how they measure potential. They also need to realize that actually does need to look different, because actually individuals show up differently. And it's almost like, how do you translate what that looks like? When I was at Sainsbury's and I did the Let's Talk About Race training, I did a whole piece in there about what you're looking for versus what you might get. So you're looking for somebody who, like I said, speaks up in meetings, but actually depending on the culture that somebody's from, some cultures are more deferential, right? So you don't speak up or challenge your boss openly. So actually you might be looking for somebody who can actually say, I don't agree. You might not find that with your ethnically diverse employees, but what you will find is they might send a follow-up email afterwards. So how we measures of success in the workplace looks very different for different groups. So organizations also need to accommodate that as well.
I think also with that point, is that as a leader, you then also need to set the expectation as you as a manager or as a leader of the team. If you guys and kind of openly and be transparent about how you like to receive any feedback, so that it kind of helps them understand that it's actually okay if you wish to speak, and if you don't wish, you can communicate me in writing over email or any other form. We can have a one-to-one. Like I do think it's just important that we go that extra mile. And like you say, that aperture and being a photographer and looking at the whole picture, I always say kind of like that peripheral vision that we have, that is where we need to sit. That's how that needs to be kind of our standard in order to make sure that we can really provide an inclusive environment for everyone and that everyone feels like they belong. Because I think that belonging piece does help to negate any sort of feelings of I'm not wanted here, that trespassing syndrome, that imposter syndrome.
Yeah. I absolutely love that. That bit around also the manager, because you're right, organizations can play a piece, but a manager, like if if your manager says, you know what, folks, I'm open to challenge. I want to hear everyone's ideas. My idea will not always be the right idea. That immediately gives people the comfortability to speak up. Love that.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Tolu. I think it's the multi-generational workforce, as I mentioned earlier. Like, I think it does definitely show up. All of these sorts of things that we've discussed shows up very much differently sometimes when we're looking at the different generations.
Yeah.
And it's a complex area. So when you're in the work that you're doing with diversity and inclusion, like, how can we tailor the initiatives to ensure that they're meeting the needs and the challenges that come up against a multi-generational workforce?
I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think, having been in DEI for a while now, it's almost like you go through the waves, right? And so you go through the waves where it's almost like something that there might be one or two things that's like the hot topic. And so we saw, massive strides being taken in the LGBTQIA agenda. Now, also in the gender agenda, then now it's kind of like race. Now we're doing a bit more around disability and neurodiversity. And I do think some organizations are doing bits around social mobility, but I do think age is where people are going to start to play in the next few years. I say that because we're also living in a time where quite a few countries have increased their retirement age. The UK, obviously, we're here in the UK. The UK has increased the retirement age consistently. I remember when I first started working, the retirement age would have been like 63 or
I
something like that.
know, I
And it's
remember that.
constantly growing.
Yeah, it's much higher. It's like, isn't it like 60? No,
That's 67,
70.
68 or
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. It's
Yeah,
nearly at 70, because you can
it's
get mortgages
continuing to
now that
go.
are like 38 years.
Yeah, yeah,
Because before, I think the highest mortgage, or the longest term mortgage here in the UK in financial services, was about 30 years, and
yeah,
that was very, and there weren't that many. There was very
yeah,
few. You had to be
yeah,
really quite young to get a 30-year term mortgage, whereas
yeah,
now you can get
yeah,
up to like 35, 38
yeah,
even, which is
yeah,
significantly long, because they're
yeah,
expecting everyone to remain in the workforce for a
yeah,
lot longer,
exactly.
which poses its own challenges, like we're discussing now. In how do you make sure that everyone feels like they actually do belong there when you've got people coming in 20 years you're younger
Yeah,
into the workforce, sitting in your team? What can we do to help them feel that they do still are valued here in the
yeah,
organization?
yeah. Because that's the thing, as the retirement age increases, people are working for longer. But then it also means that, and I want to set the scene, you've got an increase in retirement age, people are expected to work for longer. But then you've got the backdrop of health. And so some people, as they get older, will have health challenges, which might make it difficult to work for longer. So what we're doing in terms of flexible work arrangements, part-time work arrangements, etc. Then you've got the shift in landscape in terms of the kind of roles and work available. So actually now we're seeing a lot more social related work, tech related work, AI, all this kind of stuff, which, without being too kind of like deterministic, maybe a lot more younger people are being involved in. So actually, how are we making sure that our older colleagues are also having access to that kind of training, right? So that we can bridge that gap. On the other hand, we also know that people are entering into the workplace younger through apprenticeships, etc., etc. So people are now working in teams with much younger people, like you rightly said, older people, younger people. We also know that actually we have some people who might be young managers who are managing a team of people who are older than them. So we're having all of these different intersections and interplays. That means we need to find a way to bridge the generational gap. I do think that there is a divide. It's either some of it could be based on like almost like an assumption that, oh, because they're older than me or because they're younger than me, they can't relate, they don't want to work with me. So there's some of that we need to break down.
Mm.
We also need to break down some of those and I would say kind of like, people might call it banter, but it probably isn't. It's probably quite mean. Like the assumptions that because somebody is old, they can't use a computer, those kind of things. And so what does that look like when you're trying to invest in the learning and the development and the capability build and the upskilling of your older demographic? It's almost like, oh, well, they probably won't be able to use AI, so we're not going to train them. No, actually
Yeah.
making sure that programs are inclusive for everyone. Likewise, not assuming that because somebody is young, they don't have the experience or skills that can add value to an organization. So I think we have to break down some of the stigma and the stereotypes that we have across generations to bridge that divide. But I think it's really about organizations looking at their life cycle and saying, how do we make sure that we're allowing people at all stages of their life to feel included? So whether or not it's about the kind of learning and development opportunities that are available for younger people, but also older people, right? It's funny, like you're more likely to give a younger person a mentor, but what about an older person? Do they need a mentor? You know, do they want to grow in certain areas of their life? It's not because somebody is
Yeah.
40, 50, 60 that they shouldn't have a mentor. We want to look at also things around policies, caring policies, time off policies. Um, you start to get into that kind of people in their 40s and 50s who become the sandwich generation. So they might be caring for children or grandchildren, but they might also be caring for aging parents. So how are we supporting them? So there's so many different ways that we can look at it. But I think organizations should be taking a step back and saying, we need to look at how we're factoring age across our HR life cycle, especially in terms of experience.
I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. You've given us so much to think about, and some really great nuggets of information, and terms. It's been fantastic. Before we wrap up, I would just like to get one piece of parting advice. I know you've given us a lot to think about, and you've given a lot of tips here for our listeners as well, but just one piece of parting advice that you can give as a lasting message to everyone listening.
So I've got a lot of nuggets. I think I had a few things swirling in my mind. My piece of advice for anyone listening is, this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say it. Apply for that job anyway. Whether you think you're qualified, apply for that job anyway. We absolutely know. I think research shows that a man is more likely to apply for a job if he can do like a handful of things on the job description, whereas a woman will only apply if she can do the majority. But actually, gender aside, I say to everybody, because actually, by the time we look at intersectionality, we look at maybe somebody who might have a disability, somebody who might, all those different factors, people are still more likely to not apply for stuff. I would say apply anyway, and figure it out when you get there. So, in fact, I'm going to change it around. My advice is say yes first and figure out the rest when you get there. So apply for that job and figure it out. Go for the promotion and figure it out. Change careers and figure it out. I think I want people to be encouraged to just try. Say yes to your future. Say yes to your dreams. Say yes to the things that you want to do and figure it out on the way.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic. That totally resonates with me. So, Tolu, thank you so much again for joining me today. And for all of our listeners, if they want to connect with you and keep up to date with what you're doing, how best can they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is my playground where I do a lot of posts and thoughts and stuff. So I've done a lot of posts recently on gratitude complex, imposter syndrome, trespasser syndrome, confidence, all of that. So LinkedIn is my playground. So you can find me on there.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I will put a link down below to your LinkedIn profile. So for everyone listening, they're able to connect with you. Once again, Tolu, like I said, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. You've given us so much insight and perspective. It's been really, really invaluable. I can't wait for us to have another chat.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.